poems in Hebrew function typically parallelisms, so that the second line is a mirror of the first line, but typically the second line either extends the first line in meaning, or it contrasts with the first line in meaning, or it connects to the first line in some synthetic way. That is, maybe it gives you the consequence of the first line, or maybe it gives you the purpose of the first line, or something like that. So you pay attention to Hebrew poetry and watch how those lines function. For example, in verse 5, "But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." You see, the parallel is between "I trusted and my heart rejoiced." And the parallel is between your steadfast love and your salvation. So it's saying the same thing, but with different language, which gives us a fuller feel of the imagination of the psalmist. So paying attention to the parallelisms, which you will read about and have read about in your textbook. We see an example of it here. And we'll see it all over in the Psalms and in the prophets. Parallelism is the way Hebrew poetry is written. And we have to pay attention to the nature of the parallel and what the parallel does to enrich and nuance and to give a fuller picture of what the poet is trying to say. So what's the theological point here? What's the main point? It's about lament and the function of lament, the propriety of lament. But it's also about how lament functions in a framework of trust. In other words, we're not lamenting to a third person. We're not lamenting in the abstract. We're lamenting to God. We're praying to God. The lamenter hasn't left God, hasn't forsaken God, hasn't given up on God. The lamenter keeps praying to God, keeps addressing God. And so the lamenter isn't moving outside of faith, but is operating within the world of faith. As he says, "I trusted," or "I trust in your unfailing love." So part of the point I think we'd want to express here is that the church is called to lament, but lament within the framework not of rebellion, of dismissal, or forsakenness, but to lament in the context of a trust, to lament within the framework of the covenant, the relationship with God. You notice the psalmist says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord, my God." The lament is real. It's painful. It's an argument. It's a complaint. But it's also a relationship. My God. And what the psalmist then reveals to us is that it's perfectly proper for those of us who call upon God as our God to lament. And to do so in the context of a trust in the covenant. Trust in God, who is the God of the faithful God of the covenant. That's why the pain is surprising, right? And hurts, because we expect the God of the covenant to be faithful. And so we call upon God to do something. Now, when we're thinking about that theological main point, then we see that in the story of Scripture, right? We want to, is this atypical? Is this unusual? Well, no. We see Moses doing it. We see Job doing it. We see Jeremiah doing it. Isaiah does it. Habakkuk does it. It's typical of Israel. In fact, the very name Israel means one who struggles with God. Remember how Jacob got that name? He wrestled with God, right? And God said, I'm going to rename you now because you have wrestled with God. That's the name Israel, one who struggles with God. And so it's part of the whole story of Israel that Israel struggles with God in prayer and in the language of lament. So it's not surprising and it's not atypical. In fact, we see it in the story in Revelation chapter 6, the souls under the altar. The martyred souls, what are they doing? They are saying something to God. They're continuing to pray, and they say, "How long, O Lord?" Same thing as Psalm 13 says, "How long?" So we pay attention to lament in the whole story of Scripture, that it is part of our faith. It's not unusual to our faith. It's not antithetical to our faith. It's part of our faith. That when we recognize the hurt and the pain in life, we have the invitation from God, from God's own prayer book, the Israel's prayer book, the Psalms, to address God with our complaint. And what is the good news there? God listens. God listens to that. God responds. And what's the Christological word? Where do we see Jesus in this story? Did Jesus ever lament? Did Jesus quote lament psalms? Yes, he did. Remember, he's hanging on the cross, and what does he quote? Psalm 22, verse 1, which is a lament psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? Notice that relationship? My God, you're my God. Why have you forsaken me? My God, and why? My God, and how long? It's a lament. Jesus himself lamented on the cross. And so Christ gives us an example of lamenting that flows out of the Psalms, like Psalm 13 or Psalm 22 and other texts that we could point to. And at the same time, Jesus expresses the trust that is embedded here in Psalm 13. Psalm 13 says, "But I trust." One of the interesting things in Psalm 13, verse 5, is the word translated "but" in the New RSV is typically how it's translated, but it's really just one little letter in Hebrew called a vav. It's just one little straight line. And it just means it's a conjunction. This is conjoined with that. It's a transition word. It could be translated "and," it could be translated "but," it could be translated "also," it could be translated "nevertheless," which is how I would prefer to translate it in this text. Nevertheless, I trusted in your steadfast love. Despite my complaint, I still trust. Thinking Christologically, that's what we see in the story of Jesus. He's lamenting on the cross, quoting Psalm 22, verse 1. And in the Gospel of Luke, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Trust. Can you lament and trust at the same time? Jesus did. This psalmist did. It's the story we see in Scripture over and over and over again. That's the good news. We're invited to lament. And trust is not antithetical to lament. We can have a faithful lament, a trusting lament, that expresses the fullness of our pain and at the same time says, "I'm going to give it over to you, God." How do I participate in that story? Oh, just think of the wounds in your own life, the chaos in your own life, the tragedies in your own life, the grief in your own life. Can you pray this prayer? Can you ask how long? Can you ask God to do something? And will you commit the trust, even though you don't have all the answers to your questions? We embrace this way of life that names the pain and still trust in the God who is faithful. And we can trust because God has a track record. We know who our God is. And even though the pain creates questions and doubts and struggles, God invites us to wrestle with God, even as we trust God, and ask how long. So Psalm 13 invites us into that sort of prayer life, both as individuals and as communities. Because Psalm 13, though it's an individual lament, was used as a communal prayer as a part of the prayer book of Israel. This is what they prayed at the temple. Have you heard many prayers like this in church? Have you had many hymns like this in church? Maybe we need to understand how to more fully participate in the story and learn to lament like Israel lament. Learn to lament like Jesus lament. To be able to raise these questions in the public community of faith and not be scandalized by them, not be afraid of them, not to accuse the one lamenting, oh, you've lost your faith, have you? No. We can lament and have faith at the same time. Jesus did. Psalm 13 does. That's the story we're invited in, that we might participate and have a healing balm for our soul.